So in the previous module, we discussed Paley's design argument, his teleological argument, and I tried to, put forward a good case for it. Now we're going to turn to criticisms of Paley's argument. And we're going to start by thinking about possible sources of complexity because that's a key element of his argument. So remember the overall argument. We say that the world is well ordered, meaning it has good complexity that works to produce some good thing. That a well-ordered thing that's like that is complex and its parts work together to produce a good effect, like a watch. A well-ordered thing is either a huge coincidence that came about as a result of a huge coincidence, or it was created by a powerful intelligence. And huge coincidences are very unlikely, and so almost certainly there is a supreme intelligence. So let's look at that second premise, the big long one. A well-ordered thing is either a huge coincidence or created by a powerful intelligence. And we asked, why should we believe this? And we didn't really get an argument, but the best I was able to come up with was that it's not clear what the alternative was, or at least that's what Paley thought. But we might wonder, well, just because Paley couldn't come up with an alternative, maybe that's a failure of his imagination, and not because the premise is true. Maybe the premise is false, and Paley just wasn't able to imagine what makes it false. So, and in fact, it almost certainly is false. There are other processes that produce complex things to start with. So learning produces something complex. Your mind becomes more complex as you learn about the subject matter. Also, reproduction, like animal sexual reproduction, or organisms that, like bacteria, that just one bacterium just splits into two. It's not sexual reproduction, but it's still reproduction. The resulting organism has or becomes as complex as the parents. The offspring becomes as complex as the parents. And in both of those cases, we have something that might be very complex come into existence without needing a powerful intelligence. In our case, maybe there is powerful intelligence and then we reproduce, but that the powerful intelligence is not an essential part of the reproduction, and we can see that by looking at the fact that plants and bacteria and all sorts of other non-intelligent organisms also reproduce. So this isn't a complete explanation of where the complexity comes from, but it does show that Paley's premise is it's false. There are lots of things that can produce there are lots of things that can have very complex causes, not just very powerful intelligences. In both of these cases, the cause and effect have more or less the same complexity. So we can really think that there are maybe four possibilities when we think about the creation of a complex object or state of affairs. So it could be that the complexity is just a big, huge coincidence. Coincidences do happen. Or it could be, as Paley thinks, that in most cases, the complexity of the creator is greater than the complexity of the created. That's his view about life. God is this more powerful, complex thing that creates all this, that creates us and the rest of the world. Or maybe the complexity of the creator and the complexity of the created are about the same, and that's what happens in reproduction sometimes, and in learning sometimes. Now, you might think that's not a complete story because we think, okay, well, so where did the parents come from? Well, they had parents. Where did their parents come from? Well, they had parents. Where did their parents come from? They had parents. And you might think, well, that can't go back in time forever. There were actually some philosophers, and at certain points, physicists, who would actually say, no, time goes infinitely in both directions. It's never going to end, but there never is a first moment. So maybe there's just have always been complex things around. But there's another possibility, which is that the complexity of the creating thing is actually less than the complexity of the created thing. And that's what we're going to talk about today. That's what happens in evolution. It also happens in other human sorts of distinctively human sorts of affairs, but we're going to talk about it as it happens in evolution, in the evolution of different species. So, but before we get into that, I want to sort of make clear what the criticism, what we're saying about the design argument. So we're considering that this principle that Paley has, a well-ordered thing, is either a huge coincidence or created by a powerful intelligence. What if that principle is false? What happens? Well, then his argument is unsound because this principle is one of the premises of the argument. Being unsound, the argument doesn't establish its conclusion. And so maybe the conclusion that God exists, maybe that conclusion is false. But as we were talking about in the evaluating arguments video, we don't actually know that. Maybe the conclusion is true, but the argument that Paley put forward and in general design arguments are just not good arguments for that conclusion, but the conclusion is still true. And maybe we can actually find another better argument for the conclusion. Or maybe, and then we would be theists, but we wouldn't be relying on a design argument. Or maybe, in fact, God exists, but we're never going to be in a position to know. And that would mean that then we should be agnostics. We should say we don't know. Maybe he does, maybe she does, but we can't tell. So the alternative to Paley's principle is that there would be multiple sources of complexity, so that a well-ordered thing would be either a huge coincidence or created by a powerful intelligence, or a copy of an equally complex thing, as in reproduction, or maybe that's kind of what's happening in learning, or something slightly more complex than its creator, or who knows, maybe there are other things, other options that I haven't thought of in making this list. So Darwin, this is a photograph of Charles Darwin. He was English. He lived in the 1800s. He came up with the theory of evolution, not entirely on his own, but substantially on his own. He published on the Origin of Species in 1859, and then there's been a lot of subsequent development of the theory of evolution. A lot happened in the 30s to the 50s, and there's actually a lot going on right now. And it's sort of developed and refined, and new sort of features are being discovered. So what is the evolutionary picture? Well, so it's like this. All life has a common ancestor. So you and me and your pet and the plants that we see outside, and the bacteria that exist, and all the fish and all the birds and everything, all of it comes from one common ancestor. And what that means is that all current organisms are descendants of that ancestor, but of course they're different, which means they're varied descendants. So you have descent, offspring reproduction, with variation. There's some change in but there's some difference between the parents and the offspring. And that's just to say that current life evolved from original life. And when we say evolution, really we just mean there's some sort of change over time. So evolution happens in a few ways, including natural selection and sexual selection and other things like what's called genetic drift. We'll be focusing in this module on natural selection. So these different mechanisms of evolution, they allow for complexity to increase without a guiding intelligence. As it turns out, I'm going to discuss natural selection in more detail in another video, and we'll see how it works without having a guiding intelligence. But it's likely to increase complexity, but not guaranteed to increase complexity. It can increase complexity. Actually, maybe saying likely is even too strong. Evolution can increase complexity, although it doesn't have to. But when it does so without a goal. Complexity is not the goal of evolution. Evolutionary processes do not have goals. They just happen. So if the theory of evolution were true, what would it show? Well, if it were true, and it is, but supposing it's true, that means that Paley's his principle about the source of complexity, that principle is false, and it means that the design argument is unsound, and that means that the design argument fails to establish God's existence. It could be that God doesn't exist, that life evolved from certain initial conditions, and that given those conditions, life isn't a coincidence, although maybe it's something of a coincidence that the right initial conditions came about. God just never shows up in the picture. Or it could be that God is acting indirectly via evolution, that God set up the world so that the right initial conditions would come together, and then life could evolve from there. So science is just silent about this issue, right? The theory of evolution does not say anything about God. There are some people who think, lots of people actually, who think that the theory of evolution says if it's true, then God does not exist. And that might be the case, but there's not by itself a valid argument. The theory of evolution it doesn't talk about God. It doesn't have anything to say about God. And so the way you would connect the theory of evolution with with God is you would say, at least in saying that God doesn't exist, is you would say if life evolved, then God does not exist. But how do we know that claim? Is that the kind of claim that biology investigates? No. Biology doesn't really investigate God, so it doesn't know about God's existence. It doesn't talk about it. If God exists, would she use evolution? That's not the kind of question that we would examine in science. It's not a question for science. So I'm sort of making this side point, which is to say that the theory of evolution is certainly true. There are lots of people who think that it's incompatible with the existence of God. People who think the theory of evolution is true, they think, the theory of evolution is true, and that shows me that God doesn't exist. Or people who think, well, if the theory of evolution were true, God wouldn't exist. But of course, God does exist. I know that because I'm a believer in God, and so the theory of evolution must be false. And I'm suggesting that both of these people are, both of those two people are mistakenly believing, have this common view that they think if life evolved, then God does not exist. Now, you might think indeed that in the end God does not exist and that we can sort of observe that from looking at evolution, but it's not the kind of thing that science by itself is going to say, because again, science does not talk about God. It investigates the natural world using experimentation. It's just God, and that's not where you're going to find in the end God. So in the rest of this module, I'm going to explain what I've talked about here is, it turns out if you think about it a little bit, you can see that Paley's key premise is just false, and given the theory of evolution, it turns out that it's false in a way that really undermines his use of that premise, and that means that his design argument is unsound and doesn't establish its conclusion. That leaves open the question of whether or not God does or doesn't exist. What the theory of evolution shows is that the design argument fails. So what I'm going to do in the rest of this module is just talk a little bit about how evolution works, how human evolution works, and how it's a process by which complexity can increase without having a guiding intelligence.